Saluton. Mi nomon estas Mik, kaj mi estas Esperantisto. Esperanto estas la lingua...
Two languages and somehow no one will talk to you.
Bone.
Translator activated.
This week we're talking about people who'd like to teach the world to sing without the use of those pesky translators. Unilalianism, baby. Bring in that title card.
The story will continue after this.
As a word, unilalianism comes from the Latin word unus and the Greek word lalia, creating a word from two roots much like the term polyamory. As a subculture, unilalianism is an underground Afro-Indigenous avant-garde art and aesthetical movement created by Carter and Ellis Wilson in Seattle, developing from Oakland, California and the Puget Sound region. That doesn't sound right. Where's the constructed languages? The nationalism? Where's that incorporation of or complete disregard for other cultures and tongues to further the ideology of one group of people? Wikipedia, you failed me. Now I have to go out into the wilds of actual textbooks and websites from this cross-reference bunker of postmodern scholastics. There has to be something on a one-world language somewhere. Maybe there's something in these history books. Throughout history, many cultures have seen their way of living and talking as the best. The Romans, the countless dynasties of China, even people like these guys. Each group grew, through assimilation of culture and tongue, into these large empires that tried to unite their regions under one banner. And aside from them not fully being around today, this idea of a common tongue and culture has stood the test of time. It wouldn't be until the 19th century that we saw these ideas emerge en masse once again, this time in a magical and peaceful land that never knew warfare for the past millennia called Europa. Oh, wait. That's Europe in German, isn't it? Europe would be a birthplace for the ideas of a one-world language. Throughout the 19th century, mostly with the revolutions of 1848 and whatever happened to France a few times, people were trying to define themselves and others into cultures and nation-states. Now, aside from a nice little joke from an ethnomusicology professor I know about the difference between Latvians and Lithuanians, the defining of who went where was muddled in many spots. It's where smaller groups inside larger empires began to fight for their freedoms. At least in Europe. It'd take a few decades for the rest of the world to get their shot. But in this hotbed of nationalism, internationalism, and the unlucky masses caught in the middle, an idea of one world language reared its head. While such an idea had existed in one form or another in reality or fiction since the 12th century, it would be in this century, and the next, where these ideas took off. The field of interlinguistics dubs these times the pioneer and foundationalist eras. For in this time of bubbling national and cultural identities, there would be people the world over who wanted for the creation of some common tongue that superseded the boundaries being drawn in both language and culture at the time. In other places the world over, and seen in as just as many today, there exists an attitude attached with identity where one language reigns over the rest. This movement can be easily summed up as either neo-nationalist since the 2010s, or nativist since at least the 19th century. For the sake of time, we'll say that these groups hold supremacist views when it comes to their language. Be it the Know-Nothings, nationalists of the mid-20th century, or even the political groups of our current day and age. Such groups would rather see some degree of their language being the only thing spoken in their country, and to a small amount in a more extreme ideation of imperialism, the only language in the world. Of course, we can't really talk about a one-tongue world without talking about the magical linguistic tool that is a constructed language. A constructed language, or conlang for short, is as the name implies, a language made intentionally by one or more people in place of the organic process of language development. For a few examples, the musical language Sol Re Sol, whatever Tolkien wrote for the elves and dwarves, or even my dear Esperanto. Constructed language groups are usually the subculture that comes to mind when someone mentions a world language. But they're not the only ones in wanting to know what everyone else is saying, because speaking a foreign language makes some people very self-conscious. If you look at this very up-to-date chart from 1908, you can see the beginnings of such international spheres thanks to the handy, export-only tool known as imperialism. While such lingua francas are more fitted to empire, they are probably the best thing we have for a while until some conlang takes off. But who knows? Maybe the auxiliary languages will fall behind against world languages like English, French, or Mandarin. Historically, constructed language movements have only reached a couple thousand native or intermediate speakers. But luckily, the one language movement and its nativist counterpart have grown in popularity since the beginning of the 20th century and only seem to have gotten bigger and bigger each decade. Nowadays, there are two groups that fall into this category of wanting one language across the world. Firstly are the internationalists, people who argue for one world language either out of using a lingua franca, auxiliary language, or just finding a way for everyone to talk to each other with some universal translator. These groups, usually around a certain language or two, seek to bring the world together through education, trade, or just daily communications through mediums like the internet to build a closer connected world through such tongues. The one world language groups do vary in both size and agendas, but like what was said earlier in this paragraph, they just want the world to talk to each other easily. The modern constructed language movements, and world language proponents, are a community of communities. From the broad range of Esperantujo to chat rooms full of Elvish or more zonal groups like the various Pan-Slavic tongues across the former Warsaw Pact, there will continue to exist people who want to have the world understand them, while they understand the rest of the world. Or if it's more fan-based, it's just to nerd out about a different worldwide connector like fandom. Then there are the neo-nationalists, who, much like the internationalist camp, want the world to speak one language. Or at least some of them do. Neo-nationalist might not be the right term here per se. These people would be in line of either isolationist or cultural conservatives, some even outright imperialists. But we're going to do what someone with any experience in economics or politics will do, and misuse a term because it sounds cool. These neo-nationalists would rather their language be isolate, something that is unchanging to the tide of outside influences to what they speak. Somewhat of a good example is the American nativist Know-Nothing Party of the 19th century, who pressed anti-immigrant ideologies and ethno-nationalism into having a lasting effect on broader American culture. Add to this the cultural imperialist, one who wants to see their culture as the one which holds itself above the rest of the world, much like empires of centuries past. The modern neo-nationalist is one who seeks to stop the process of globalization and surprisingly varies on other ideological fronts and pursuits based on whatever nation they're within. The history of neo-nationalist thoughts is a long one, and we didn't really cover it in the build-up because of that reason. So to simplify it, with the idea of the nation-state came people who wanted to preserve it, which leads to your nativist and similar organizations popping up around the 19th century. Where we get to modern neo-nationalism is with the end of the Cold War and the greater spread of globalist ideas, which included freedom of movement in one form or another. Neo-nationalism doesn't like this. Such activities dilute their culture and threaten a way of life they know and love. So they'd rather see to it that people assimilate into their culture or stay away and ruin someone else's because the outsider can't fully integrate like their children will. And to state this yet again, this whole globalist versus nativist debate is a complicated issue, even for someone who wrote his bachelor's thesis on immigration and cultural integration. So, doing what this channel does best, I'd say start here for some baseline ideas, and then do your own research with the collection of sources we have in that document in the description. But on the issue of people doing people things, who exactly are we talking about here? Spanning from languages like Communicationsprache, Simlish, and the wingdings that make up bliss symbols, the usually internationalist conlang camp is made up of various people from equally various backgrounds, all united in language. These camps are multifaceted and multicultural in their own makeup, with the best comparison I can make being that of fandom in its uniting power between individuals. Some aspects centered around these languages is stuff like the Esperanto Passport to Servo, which is just couch crashing for Esperantistoi. There are several con-language cons across the world, along with forums in every corner of the internet. Unsurprisingly, conlang subcultures can attract people from any walk of life, from a Japanese salaryman to a Ukrainian anarcho-punk, even the elusive American corporate hippie. So there really isn't a whole who exactly are these people answer, outside of bluntly saying people who speak and live with constructed languages and want for a world with an easier way to talk to others. As for the neo-nationalists, both the expansion and isolation kinds, it's going to be about as baseline as the conlang gang. The two flavors of neo-nationalists both are people who want their culture, or at the very least language, to hold top priority, whether it be just at home or abroad as well. Outside the example of every foreign tourist ever, political organizations like the American Tea Party would be what can commonly be associated with such ideas. Or basically, anyone who sees the influence of external forces upon their own language or culture can fall into this group in one form or another. So, the Académie Française not wanting any modern loanwords in their Parisian dialects, the jingoistic Americans who echo the sentiments of the Babel Proclamation regardless of state, or more broadly, anyone of the mindset that minority languages should not exist within their country to any degree. Where we do not expand this to cover is the more smaller movements, languages whose people are minority groups in a country already, like the Basque, Suret, or Livonian. These people are more or less fighting to keep a close to dying language or culture alive in one form or another. There is some overlap with the larger groups mentioned earlier, but where they differ is through their minority status and greater risk for endangerment. But more on these language fears later. First we have to ask, why exactly do we even have these two kinds of groups in the first place? Well, it all comes down to ideology. In a more positive take on linguistic expansion, the One World Language and International Auxiliary Language groups seek to unite Earth under a common tongue for easier communication for various activities. For a better example, Ludwig Zamenhof created Esperanto because of the time-consuming practices for each individual language at a time, what with him being in 19th century Poland and all. Such is the idea behind the conlang aspect of the auxiliary languages, changing what would have been someone learning Polish, Yiddish, German, and Russian into just Esperanto. A comparatively easier language based on aspects of several Indo-European languages. And I should note this before the comments decide to jump in on it, despite it being implied. A lot of conlangs like Esperanto would be happy taking up a position as an international auxiliary language, much like Latin for the Catholic Church, or English or Mandarin for business. If you really do want a dominant language, we'll have to look elsewhere. Now as for our neo-nationalist, nativist, or whatever term fits them best groups, they usually harbor their hatred of other languages out of some form of protecting the existing social hierarchy due to perceived external threats. We can see the rise of these nativist ideas following large influxes of immigrants, or around specific historical events. Their features include the erasure of cultural and linguistic identity by a minority group to a point where the once majority is the new minority. And before I go on some rant about integration and all that, these fears are understandable ones when you look at human psychology. But to alleviate where I can from what all I've picked up from various courses on borders, immigration, and cultural identity, first generation and later immigrants will usually assimilate into the dominant culture. This includes languages. For those still concerned with such subjects, I'd recommend a few texts which are appearing on screen. They should also be in the sources document unless the team and I forget. There are, as we have mentioned, some more imperialistic aspects of neo-nationalists who would rather see the rest of the world speak their language. Their motives are more just that of their nativist counterparts, but on a global scale instead of national. So outside of this short outlining segment, is there anything wrong with the one world language, or even a lack thereof? In the Land of Invented Languages, a 2009 book by Akira Arendt, she denotes the hatred of Esperanto and other conlangs by portions of the linguistic community. Chiefly, their claims of there being no culture with the language itself, much like the endless constructed languages from the pioneer era. Now, while Esperanto does have a culture, Arendt notes that the language just attaches itself to the culture of the speaker, where we can still see Cubans, Danes, and Ethiopians in their cultural contexts, just with a new linguistic filter that world languages like English, French, or Arabic could slide into. There's this argument that constructed languages are going to fail when the existing languages are more prevalent thanks to empire, religion, and trade. So what about a one-world language like the empires of yore? If we work off an idea of linguistic momentum noted in a 1993 paper, we can see that world languages arise from the classic trio of conquest, commerce, and conversion. That's how Rome added a man empire, Spanish became the language of most of Latin America, and Arabic, in one dialect or another, worked its way from Rabat to Muscat. The spread of languages naturally, and adoption by one person or another due to the convenience of completing one of the three goals, was the way of life since humanity began interacting between cultures. Where constructed languages fail in a way is that they are artificial in implementation. There is not a community of solely native speakers of such tongues, so the big three would not help it spread. Now, while Esperanto does have roughly a Nebraska's worth of speakers at maximum, the language is auxiliary. which again would mean you could use something like Tamil or Swedish with easier access than La Lingua Internazia. This doesn't even touch on the issue of realities of a one-world language yet either. So here's a fun little factoid I love to bring up about how dialects can change languages over a relatively short time. In the 1949 book, Earth Abides, a whole accent and the beginnings of a new language develops within a community over 3 generations. This issue is one discussed in academia as well, with the father of structural linguistics and brother to the creator of Esperanto 2 himself, Ferdinand de Saussure, bringing up that even constructed languages like Esperanto will organically change at a slow pace much like other languages, with these dialects eventually becoming languages of their own, and the whole problem starting all over again like some internationalist Tower of Babel. This loss of a central language to competitors both internal and external. Such an issue arose with the fall of the Soviet Union, where a central language was abandoned for local and more useful languages like English or German, or the general loss of French to English as well in the European theater since the 80s. Then there's the ideology issues, which is more of a problem with your neo-nationalist versus globalist language wars over preservation or assimilation in their own rights. From a nationalistic point of view, these one-world languages will destroy culture and civilization through some hegemony run by someone outside and uncaring to anyone that is not in their group. Which is a bit ironic, as these groups, taken to such an imperialistic extreme of cultural superiority, would be doing the same thing much like the actions of empires over the course of millennia prior. But there is that concern over the erasure of identity rather than assimilation or dominance that is the more understandable aspect of such movements. From the other perspective, one of global language and cosmopolitanism, the issue is more logistical. Many would just want an auxiliary language, with the odd handful of linguistic domination desires being lobbed into the same imperialistic extreme as their nationalistic counterparts. But where this way of thinking falls is the issue of linguistic drifts and willing mass adoption. So while we could see the growth of a world language in the next century or two, the one-tonguedness of it all may be lost in a sea of drawl, twang, or variation pronunciation. Unilalianism. While not literally what was written on the box, it does live up to the name I mistakenly threw at it. From people wanting to understand the world in as many ways, to other people wanting to understand the world in the subjectively best way, the ideas behind a one-tongued world are something that captivate and delight language and culture nerds the world over. Too bad it gets more complicated from here. We haven't even touched on the actual Unilalian movement. Luckily for everyone, there's a video that should be uploading within the next. We'll see you when I figure out how to read Arabic.